Although the beginning of US India relations dates back to the days of the American Revolutionary War, it is believed to have started with a couple of historic visits by two prominent figures of the 19th century. Indian Hindu monk and philosopher Swami Vivekananda promoted yoga and Vedanta in the United States at the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. This was followed by Mark Twain, an American writer and humorist, who visited India in 1896 and said that India was the only foreign land he dreamed about or longed to see again. In the 1930s and early 1940s, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, voiced strong support for the Indian independence movement despite being allies with Britain. Roosevelt led the popular American demand that India be given independence, and it was based on the American position against the Europeans having colonies. Post India's independence during the Cold War, the United States leaned towards favoring India under the Truman administration. In fact, most of the US planners saw India as more valuable diplomatically than neighboring Pakistan. However, Nehru's policy of non-alignment was perceived negatively, which halted the evolving alliance between the two nations. Prime Minister Nehru also rejected American suggestions for resolving the Kashmir crisis via third-party mediation in 1949. And then his visit to the United States following year was deemed as an undiplomatic disaster that left bad feelings on both sides. Prime Minister Nehru refused to align with the United States, and the American Secretary of State Dean Eston quoted Nehru as one of the most difficult men with whom he had ever had to deal. India also rejected the American advice that it should not recognize the communist conquest of China. While all these events widened the gap between the two countries, India's support for the 1950 United Nations resolution condemning North Korea's aggression in the Korean War kept the communication still alive. A poor harvest in India and then the aid of millions of dollars from the United States made the relationship continue for more than a decade. In 1959, inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's non-violent struggle for national independence, US civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in India for a month-long tour. He met with Prime Minister Nehru, Gandhi's family and friends and scholars. After returning to the United States, King said that the trip had reaffirmed his commitment to nonviolent resistance, calling it the most potent weapon available to oppressed people and their struggle for justice and human dignity. Later in 1959, President Dwight Eisenhower visited India and became the first serving US president to do so. Eisenhower met with President Rajendra Prasad and Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and addressed Indian Parliament. In 1962, 9 American universities and the U.S. Agency for International Development helped establish one of the first Indian institutes of technology in India. Under the Kanpur Indo-American program, American faculty members developed academic programs and research laboratories at the new university over a decade. The partnership was one of many examples of higher education collaboration between the two countries. Under the guidance of economist John Kenneth Galbraith, IIT Kanpur was the first institute in India to offer computer science education. On 20th October 1962, the war broke out between India and China over a disputed frontier. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru wrote to President John F. Kennedy to request support from the United States. Washington supported India in the conflict, recognizing the McMahon Line as the border and provided air assistance and arms. After that, strategic and military ties between Washington and Delhi remained close under Kennedy administration. In 1963, U.S. agronomist Norman Borlaug traveled to India to begin testing high-yield wheat varieties. His collaboration with Indian scientist Dr. M.S. Swaminathan resulted in the Green Revolution, and India went from food scarcity to self-sufficiency within a decade. After the assassination of Kennedy on 20th November 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson maintained the relationship with India, but he also sought to strengthen the ties with Pakistan with the hopes of easing tensions with China and weakening India's growing military buildup. Relations then hit an all-time low under the Nixon administration in the early 1970s. Nixon shifted away from the neutral stance that his predecessors had taken towards India-Pakistan hostilities. He established a very close relationship with Pakistan, aiding it militarily and economically, as India, now under the leadership of Indira Gandhi, was leaning towards Soviet Union. The US openly supported Pakistan during the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War, and later it opposed India in 1974 for conducting its first nuclear test. In the late 1970s, with the Janata Party leader Morarji Desai becoming the Prime Minister, India improved its relations with the US, and that continued despite Indira Gandhi returning to power in 1980. In 1978, the Carter administration enacted the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act, which required countries not included in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which included India, to allow inspections of all nuclear facilities by the International Atomic Energy Agency. India refused, and Washington ended all nuclear assistance to Delhi. In 1982, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi met with President Ronald Reagan during a state visit to improve the country's strained relationship. The leaders ended up agreeing to increase cooperation and resolve a dispute over nuclear power. A toxic gas and a chemical leak in December 1984 at American-owned Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, killed thousands. India unsuccessfully sought extradition of the company's chief executive from the United States for criminal prosecution. The incident strained US-India relations and continued to complicate the bilateral relationship years after that. US President Ronald Reagan provided limited assistance to India between 1985 to 1987. Washington approved the supply of selected technology to India, including gas turbines for naval frigates and engines for prototypes for India's light combat aircraft. There were also unpublicized transfers of technology, including the engagement of US company Continental Electronics. Between 1989 and 1993, US President George H.W. Bush, a strong supporter of Indian democracy, pushed for lasting Indo-Pak peace. He talked about dealing with the Indian government with respect and quality. In 1981, the government of Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao launched sweeping economic reforms that helped expand economic ties with the United States. The opening of the market in India allowed great interaction between the Indian and US business communities, and this became a critical cementing factor in the bilateral relations. Under US President Bill Clinton and Indian Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, between 1993 to 1996, both sides mishandled relations. Clinton simultaneously pressured India to liberalize its economy while criticizing New Delhi on human rights and nuclear issues. In 1998, under the leadership of Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the Indian government announced the completion of series of underground nuclear tests close to the border with Pakistan, surprising US intelligence organizations and raising fears the move could spark regional nuclear arms race. The test drew international condemnation and badly damaged India's relationship with the United States. President Bill Clinton imposed economic sanctions on India, including cutting off all military and economic aid and prohibiting American aerospace technology and uranium exports to India. However, these sanctions proved ineffective. India was experiencing a strong economic rise, and its trade with the US only constituted a small portion of its GDP. The sanctions were soon lifted. Afterward, the Clinton administration and Prime Minister Vajpayee exchanged representatives to help rebuild relations. In May 1999, Pakistani forces infiltrated Indian-administered Kashmir. India launched airstrikes in return, and armed conflict continued through early July that year. After President Clinton summoned Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to Washington for a 4th of July emergency meeting, Sharif withdrew Pakistani forces from their positions beyond the line of control. In March 2000, US President Clinton visited India, undertaking bilateral and economic discussions with Prime Minister Vajpayee. This would mark the first US presidential trip to India since 1978. During the visit, the Indo-US Science and Technology Forum was established. During the George W. Bush administration, relations between India and the United States blossomed, primarily over common concerns regarding growing Islamic extremism, energy security, and climate change. Since 2004, Washington and New Delhi have been pursuing a strategic partnership that is based on shared values and generally convergent geopolitical interests. In November 2010, President Barack Obama visited India and addressed a joint session of the Indian Parliament, where he backed India's bid for a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. In September 2014, during Narendra Modi made his first visit as Prime Minister to the United States, aiming to attract investment and firm up US-India strategic partnership. Modi's event included a sold-out space in New York's Madison Square Garden. In Washington, Modi and President Obama reached an agreement on a memorandum of understanding between the Export-Import Bank and an Indian energy agency, which provided up to $1 billion help India develop low-carbon energy alternatives and aid U.S. renewable energy exports to India. President Obama made his second visit to India as head of state for India's Republic Day celebrations in January 2015. The president heralded the relationship between the world's two largest democracies, saying, "America can be India's best partner." President Obama and Prime Minister Modi agreed to collaborate in the implementation of India's ambitious Digital India program and expand commercial cooperation while encouraging investment engagement in the information and communication technology. In September 2015, both leaders agreed to revitalize the existing partnership and find new areas for collaboration and mutual benefit. Prime Minister Modi held meetings with top American CEOs and outlined his vision for Startup India, Stand Up India. During Prime Minister Modi and President Obama's final meeting in the White House, United States elevated India to major defense partner, a status no other country holds. President Trump grew closer to India's BJP government, which shared the same right-wing views. He repeatedly praised Modi's leadership and avoided any negative criticism of the Indian government's actions on the citizenship and Kashmir dispute. On 21st December 2020, Trump awarded Modi with the Legion of Merit for elevating India-United States relations. In 2021, during a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Modi, President Joe Biden said the relationship between India and the US, the largest democracies in the world, is destined to be stronger, closer, and tighter. US President Joe Biden hailed US-India ties while rolling out the pomp and pageantry for visiting Prime Minister Narendra Modi in June 2023. Prime Minister Modi, who was on a state visit, also addressed the US Congress, where he received multiple standing ovations, one of them being for his remark on AI America India relationship. Both the leaders announced defense and commercial deals to improve military and economic ties between their nations. During G20 Summit 2023, two leaders met again for a bilateral dialogue to deepen the bond between India and